Welcome to our 78th podcast for Thanks for Your Service. Our focus is on historical topics relating to the Australian military. You can find us on Facebook, X and YouTube. Just search for Thanks for Your Service. Our website is www.thanksforyourservice.net and you can email us at info@thanksforyourservice.net. Who would have known that Rowville, a suburb of Melbourne, hosted a prisoner of war camp during World War II? Author Darren Arnott tells us about the history, including his book about a darker chapter of the camp. Joining us on the line from Melbourne is author Darren Arnott. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Now, in our preamble, in our little chat we had before we started recording, we talked about the little-known aspects of Australian military history that we can find in our own backyard, and that's what got me onto chatting to you today. But who would believe a World War II prisoner of war camp in suburban Melbourne? So where exactly was the camp?
So the camp was in a suburb called Rowville. So Rowville is almost 30 kilometres east of Melbourne. And the camp was located at the intersection of the two main highways, Stud and Wellington Roads.
Can you give us a background about the camp? When was it established? What's part of the history of it?
The camp was initially constructed in 1942. So it was used by Australian troops. The 3rd Motor Brigade Group was stationed there for a period of time. And that was at a time when there was actually concern that there may have been a Japanese invasion over Western Port Bay. So there were troops stationed there. Once they moved on, they were relocated to Seymour, and then US Marines, thousands of US Marines were stationed there for a period of time, and they were then shipped to fight some of the battles in the Pacific. And then it became an Italian prisoner of war camp in December 1944.
So it started its life off as an Australian military camp, and then progressed to the POW camp for the Italians. But in terms of its initial setup, why was Rowville selected as the camp location?
For the POWs?
Well, initially, even for the military camp.
Well, for the military camp, I think there was concern that if a likely invasion path from Western Port Bay may have been up through Gippsland over the Listerfield Hills and then towards Melbourne, so that was seen as a pathway to defend.
And that's interesting because I go back to one of my earlier podcasts about the Victorian, the colonial defences of Victoria, and that was exactly the same scenario they had in terms of a likely, I think it was a Russian invasion through Western Port, up into the entrances of Victoria. So there was a lot of militia and colonial defence training around that particular area as well. If we go back to the 1940s, what was Rowville like?
So Rowville was a very small rural area, small population, quite isolated. There were a few market gardens, a few farmers. There would have been orchards to the north and to the west as you head towards the city, but quite a rural place. The nearest township was Dandenong, which was a few kilometres down the road. So if you needed any supplies, that's where you would have needed to go.
And as you said, the camp itself started off as a military base for the Australians and the Americans, and then was turned into a POW camp for the Italians. Do you have any idea of what was the daily life like of a POW at Rowville?
Yeah, so it was... So just a couple of things about the camp. When it was full, there were about 250 prisoners there, and it was a mixture of buildings and military tents. And the daily life of a prisoner would be they'd get up at 7 o'clock, have breakfast, there would be a head count, then they would get on a truck and be taken to their place of work for the day. They would then return to the camp by about 5 o'clock, have dinner at 6 o'clock where there'd be another head count, and then 10 p.m. there'd be a roll call and lights out, and that was pretty much the daily life from a working perspective. But they also had plenty of time for recreation and other activities. So they would play soccer, they would play cards. There were 2 recreation huts where they could, if it was raining, they could go in there. There were often movies shown in Italian. Another interesting aspect about the camp was they had their own cooks, so they could enjoy their Italian food. And it was interesting in some of the archive material I found a ration stocktake sheet of the food that was ordered in. And there were three columns. One column was for the items ordered, one column was for the military personnel, and the other column was for the Italian prisoners of war. And I noticed that the Italians had substituted a couple of things, and they'd ordered 224 pounds of macaroni, so 100 kilograms, 154 pounds of spaghetti, 70 kilograms, and 48 pounds of tomatoes, 21 kilograms. So they were able to enjoy some good pasta.
Now, in terms of the war for the Italians, it was effectively over in 1943 with the signing of the armistice with the Allies. And so at that stage, they were still POWs in Australia.
Yes.
And then obviously the war ended in 1945. But why were they still being held as POWs? At what stage were they classified as internees rather than POWs?
So, yeah, their status changed in 1943. And that was a point in time when it was considered they could go to work without the need of a guard. So that status changed. But I think not much else could change, because if you think about it, I think there were around 18,000 Italian prisoners of war who'd come to Australia. So it was, partly a logistical problem. If they were suddenly let out into society, how would that work? Also, possibly from a bit of a selfish perspective, they were an essential part of labour for the country, making up for the massive labour shortage in factories and on farms that the country was experiencing at the time. So that possibly influenced them, remaining in that status that they were.
I think you were saying, well, you said earlier that there were about 250 POW/internees at Rowville. What did you say about the total population of POWs, Italian POWs in Australia?
18,500.
Wow. Okay, so that is a significant workforce.
Yeah. Also, in the life of the camp, so between December 44 and August 1946, 2,600 prisoners passed through that Rowville camp.
Wow.
So,
okay.
Yeah. And it was also, the Rowville camp was also used as a staging camp. So it was, because it was kind of a bit of a gateway to the city and a gateway to Gippsland, it was a point where prisoners were there temporarily before they were shipped to another place of work.
The war ended. Were many of the internees, did they stay in Australia, or were they repatriated back to Italy?
They all needed to go back home to Italy, but they could come back through like a sponsorship and immigration process. In saying that, some did stay at large for quite a period of time, to the point where Arthur Colwell, the Minister for Immigration, gave them an ultimatum. This was, I think, at the end of 1947. He said, I think there were almost 50 prisoners at large, and he said, present yourself to a police station, we'll send you home and you will be allowed to apply to come back. But if you don't, we will just deport you and you're never coming back to Australia.
Now, Darren, the primary reason that we're having a chat today is focused on a period in March 1946 where a group of Italian POWs, or internees, were still at Rowville. And in 2019, you wrote a book titled No Regard for the Truth, Friendship and Kindness, Tragedy and Injustice, Rowville's Italian Prisoners of War. Tell us about your book.
Yeah, so No Regard for the Truth primarily follows the story of a young Italian prisoner of war named Rodolfo Bertoli. He was a 26-year-old prisoner from Florence in Italy. He was captured, and he was in the Rowville camp for a period of time. And one evening, he was shot and killed by the camp commandant during an alleged escape attempt, which then became very controversial. Just prior to that shooting, an official government inquiry into the administration of the camp about mistreatment of prisoners, alleged mistreatment of prisoners, had been announced. So that announcement and the shooting was sort of met with further suspicion. So the book goes into the story of Rodolfo, the shooting, the investigations into the shooting, also a bit about Rodolfo's romance with a local girl. And then it continues following the investigations right through to its final outcome, and the Italians eventually going back home to Italy.
And if people want to find out what the outcome is, they can obviously get your book. But can you tell us, in terms of preparation and writing the book, what resources do you have to access?
So yeah, a couple of things. There were plenty of press articles from the time, which that sort of, that's one aspect of the story. The main source of material was at the National Archives. There was all of the court documents, all of the investigation documents, all of the witness statements, some of the evidence even, that I could access and read to try and put the story together. There were also, when I wrote this or when I was researching it, there were also still some locals who were there at the time. So I was able to get first-hand accounts of stories and their memories. So, and that really brought it to life.
When you wrote the book, I understand that his former Australian girlfriend was still alive in her 90s in Queensland.
Yeah, that's right. I was, I had actually just finished my first manuscript and submitted that to my editor, and I contacted an extended member of the family that this girl was from. And she contacted me and we chatted a bit, and she chatted to her extended family and discovered that her auntie was the love interest of Rodolfo, and she was living in Queensland. So I was able to fly up to Queensland and go and meet her and her younger sister, who was also, was Nora. She was 20 at the time, and her younger sister Carmel was 16. So, and when I arrived at their house, the table was covered in letters and photographs and newspaper cuttings. Goodness. And which I was able to use in the book as well.
Obviously, Rodolfo was shot during this alleged escape attempt. Is he buried in Australia?
He is. His body is in the Osario at the Murchison Cemetery in central Victoria. So that's a purpose-built building, and there's 130, well, the bodies of 130 Italians who passed away in prisoner of war camps all around Australia during World War II.
And what's left of the camp today, if anything?
So it just so happens that the location where the shooting took place is in a small preserved bushland reserve within a housing estate called Starlight Reserve, and in that reserve is the concrete foundations of a toilet block of all things and a bit of the road. But it is the very location where the shooting took place.
Is there any type of plaque or signage indicating that the camp was there?
There is, yeah, and a little bit about Rodolfo in the story as well. So if you visit Starlight Reserve in Roval, you can see a bit of information about the camp and the story of the shooting.
Now, the most important question of the day is that where can people get your book?
Yes, you can get it from my website, which is darrenarnott.com. Most online retailers, or if you just walk into your bookstore, local bookstore, and ask for No Regard for the Truth by Darren Arnott, they should be able to order it in for you. I should also add it was shortlisted for the Victorian Community History Awards in 2020, which was a huge surprise and a great privilege. Good
on you. Excellent. Well, I received my copy the other day, so I'm very much looking forward to reading and again, learning about some aspects of Australian military history in our own backyard that we had no idea about.
Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you so much for joining us today. That's the podcast for today. We're keen to hear your feedback by leaving a review on your podcast app. Your review helps new listeners find our podcast. If you have any special requests or suggestions for our podcast, please get in touch. You can help support this podcast via Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. The links are on our website and Facebook page, and your support helps us with the production of this podcast. Do you have a relative who has served in the Australian military? Our family military history research packages sources records to better understand the service and experience of those who have served. You can find out more information on our website. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your service.